Daniels turned toward the approaching car, his muscles tensing instinctively. The headlights were blinding against the dark street, and for a split second, he thought backup had been sent anyway. But as the vehicle slowed and rolled to a stop, he realized this wasn't a patrol car. It was something else. Something unexpected. The captain didn't move. She just watched, her expression unreadable, as the driver's side door swung open. A tall man in plainclothes stepped out, his movements slow, deliberate. Daniels didn't recognize him, but there was something about the way he carried himself, something that set off alarms in his mind. The man glanced at the captain, then at Daniels. "Looks like I showed up at the right time," he said, his voice calm but edged with something unspoken. Daniels' hand drifted toward his belt. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket, and every muscle in Daniels' body went tight. His fingers twitched toward his holster again, but before he could react, the man pulled out a badge and held it up under the glow of the streetlights. Daniels' stomach dropped. "Detective Marcus Steele," the man said, slipping the badge back into his pocket. "Internal Affairs." A heavy silence settled over the street. Daniels' mouth went dry. Internal Affairs. He stole a glance at the captain, but she wasn't looking at him. Her eyes were locked on Steele, her jaw tight. Steele stepped closer, his gaze sharp as it flicked between them. "Got an interesting call tonight," he said casually. "Word is, there was a traffic stop involving a police captain, and the officer on scene nearly pulled his weapon on her." His eyes landed on Daniels. "That sound about right?" Daniels felt his chest tighten. This couldn't be happening. Not like this. "I was handling the situation," he said, forcing his voice to stay steady. Steele tilted his head slightly, like he was considering that. Then he turned to the captain. "Is that what happened?" The captain was silent for a long moment. Daniels could feel his pulse hammering in his throat. If she reported him now, if she told Internal Affairs exactly how this night had unfolded, his career could be over. But instead of answering, she did something that made Daniels' stomach twist even harder. She smiled. It wasn't friendly, it wasn't reassuring. It was the kind of smile that told him he wasn't ready for what came next. And in that moment, Daniels realized something. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Daniels' breath felt tight in his chest as the silence stretched. The captain's smile lingered just long enough to make him uneasy before she finally turned to Steele. "I think Officer Daniels and I had a learning moment tonight," she said, her voice calm, almost too calm. "Wouldn't you agree, officer?" Daniels swallowed hard. He could feel the trap closing around him, but he wasn't sure how to escape it. He glanced at Steele, whose expression remained unreadable. He was waiting, just like the captain, to see what Daniels would say. He had two choices. He could defend himself, insist that he'd just been following protocol, that it wasn't what it looked like, or he could admit the truth, that when he saw the captain standing by her car, his first instinct hadn't been reason. It had been suspicion. Assumption. His jaw clenched. Every fiber of his being told him to protect himself, to spin it, to control the narrative before it controlled him. But then he met the captain's gaze again, and for the first time, he saw something he hadn't before. She wasn't just angry. She was disappointed. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He'd spent years believing he was one of the good ones, that he wasn't that asterisk kind of cop. But standing here, under the weight of this moment, he wasn't so sure anymore. He took a slow breath. "I was wrong," he said finally, the words tasting foreign in his mouth. "I misjudged the situation." The captain didn't react right away. Then, after a beat, she nodded, just once. Steele exhaled through his nose, almost like he'd expected that answer all along. "Honest," Steele said. "That's a start." Daniels felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. Steele stepped forward, lowering his voice. "But there's still a problem." He reached into his pocket again, pulling out his phone. He tapped the screen once, then turned it around. A video played. Daniel's stomach dropped. It was bodycam footage, his bodycam footage. The entire traffic stop, captured from the moment he pulled up to the captain's car. Every movement, every word. The hesitation before his hand went to his weapon. The way his tone shifted. And it wasn't just on Steele's phone. It had been uploaded, documented. There was no rewriting the narrative now. The captain glanced at the screen, then back at Daniels. Daniels stared at the phone screen, his pulse pounding in his ears. The footage was undeniable. No amount of explanations or justifications would change what had happened. He had made a mistake, one that had been recorded, one that couldn't be erased. The captain didn't gloat. She didn't have to. Her point had been made long before Steele arrived. Daniels had seen it in her eyes, felt it in the weight of her words. This wasn't just about one traffic stop. It was about something bigger. Steele slipped his phone back into his pocket. Internal Affairs will review the footage. You'll be placed on administrative leave until a decision is made. His tone was even, but Daniels could hear the finality in it. This was happening, whether he was ready or not. Daniels nodded stiffly. He wanted to argue, to push back, to say this wasn't fair. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. This asterisk was asterisk fair. The captain exhaled, looking at him one last time. "I don't know what's going to happen to you, Daniels," she said. "But I hope you think about what happened here tonight. Really think asterisk about it." He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just watched as she turned and walked away, her footsteps steady, confident. Steele followed a moment later, leaving Daniels alone under the flashing lights of his patrol car. The night felt colder now, quieter. As he stood there, the weight of everything settled onto his shoulders. This wasn't just about his job. It was about who he was, who he had allowed himself to become. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he liked the answer. The radio crackled to life on his shoulder. Another call coming in, but it wasn't for him. Not anymore. Daniels reached up, unfastened the radio, and turned it off. Then, without another word, he climbed into his car and drove away, disappearing into the night. Daniels shifted uncomfortably, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The flashing lights of his patrol car cast sharp shadows across the pavement, distorting the woman's face in flickering red and blue. His mind raced, grasping for a way to regain control of the situation, but something told him he had already lost it. The woman, Captain watched him closely, arms crossed, her stance unshaken. She was waiting, for what he wasn't sure. An excuse, an apology. He wasn't ready to give her either. "This isn't what it looks like," he muttered, but even as the words left his mouth, he realized how weak they sounded. She raised an eyebrow. "Really? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you were about to pull a gun on a fellow officer." Her voice wasn't angry, but there was an edge to it, something deeper than frustration. Daniels clenched his jaw, his pulse still racing. He could feel the sweat on his palms, the way his fingers still hovered too close to his holster. He forced himself to step back, just slightly, but she noticed. She noticed everything. "You know what the worst part is?" she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "I saw it in your face. The moment you looked at me, you made up your mind about who I was." Daniels wanted to argue, to say she was wrong. That this was just procedure, that it wasn't personal, but he knew better. He knew what had been running through his head when he saw her standing there, alone, next to that car. And now, standing in front of her, it made him sick to admit it. A long silence stretched between them before she finally spoke again. "I've been on the force for 15 years. I've trained officers, led investigations, sat in rooms full of men who didn't think I deserved to be there. And still, after all that, I find myself here, being treated like a suspect, by my own department." Daniels swallowed hard, but before he could respond, the radio on his shoulder crackled to life. A dispatcher's voice cut through the tension. "Unit 24, status check. Do you require backup?" The question hung in the air. Backup. Daniels knew what that meant. If he responded the wrong way, this situation could spiral even further out of his control. His fingers twitched near his radio. He had a choice to make, and the captain was watching, waiting to see what he would do next. Daniel's fingers hovered over his radio, his throat tight. He could feel the weight of the captain's gaze pressing down on him, waiting, testing. The radio crackled again, the dispatcher's voice more insistent this time. Unit 24, status check. Do you require backup? Backup. The word echoed in his head like a warning. If he called it in, more officers would arrive. More guns. More chances for this night to spiral into something worse than it already was. But if he didn't respond, if he hesitated too long, they'd send someone anyway. And then what? His pulse pounded in his ears. His training told him one thing, his instincts told him another, and somewhere in between, the truth gnawed at him. He had messed up. Badly. And the woman in front of him, his superior, his Captain knew it. Finally, he pressed the button on his radio, his voice tight. Unit 24, situation is under control. Static hummed in the air before the dispatcher's voice came back, slower this time, more measured. Copy that, Unit 24. Daniels exhaled, but the pressure in his chest didn't ease. The captain hadn't moved, hadn't looked away. She was still studying him, as if trying to decide what kind of officer, what kind of man he really was. You hesitated, she said finally, her voice quieter now. Daniels stiffened. You weren't sure what to say, she continued, stepping closer. You were debating whether to call for backup on me. Daniels clenched his jaw. I was assessing the situation. Her lips pressed into a thin line. And what did you decide? He didn't answer, because the truth was, he didn't know. His hands curled into fists at his sides, frustration twisting inside him. Frustration at for pushing him, at himself for letting things get this far, at the gnawing voice in the back of his head whispering that maybe, just maybe, he needed to hear this. The captain took another step forward, closing the space between them. The street was quiet now, just the hum of the distant city and the occasional rustle of wind. You have a problem, Daniels, she said, her voice steady but sharp. And I don't just mean tonight. His stomach dropped. The words hit harder than he expected. Before he could respond, another car rolled up, headlights cutting through the dark. Daniels turned, tension spiking again. He wasn't sure who it was. But something told him the night was about to get even worse. Sure, here's an engaging and suspenseful introduction for your YouTube video. The night air was thick with tension as Officer Daniels gripped the handle of his holstered gun, his eyes locked onto the woman standing beside her car. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the pavement, casting long shadows as he took slow, deliberate steps forward. His radio crackled, but he ignored it. Right now, his focus was on the suspect in front of him. A black woman, alone. Hands where I can see them, he barked, his voice edged with authority and suspicion. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she took a steady breath, keeping her hands visible as she turned to face him fully. Her expression was calm, almost unlovingly so. Officer, is there a problem? Her voice was firm, but respectful. Daniels narrowed his eyes. He had made up his mind the moment he saw her. This was routine. A late-night traffic stop, a suspicious individual, and now compliance or confrontation. He reached for his gun, not quite drawing it, but close enough that the threat was clear. Step out of the vehicle, now. The woman sighed but didn't argue. She moved slowly, deliberately, and as she did, something about her posture, the way she carried herself, unsettled him. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't flustered. She looked in control. Officer, I think you should check your attitude before you make a mistake, she said, locking eyes with him. Daniels felt a flicker of doubt. A mistake. Who did she think she was? His grip on his weapon tightened. And then she reached into her pocket. Instinct took over. His pulse spiked. His training screamed at him to react. But before he could move, she pulled out something that made his breath catch in his throat. A badge. Not just any badge. A police captain's badge. His mouth went dry. His pulse thundered in his ears. The realization hit him like a truck. He had just pulled his weapon on a superior officer. And judging by the look on her face, she wasn't going to let it slide. That cliffhanger should keep your audience hooked and eager to watch more. Let me know if you want any tweaks. Daniel's heart pounded as his mind scrambled to process what he was looking at. A police captain. His eyes darted from the badge to the woman's face, but she didn't move, didn't say a word.